Spear maintenance is one of those things that's easy to overlook. You go out spear fishing all day, you come back, you're really tired, you just want to deal with the fish and then get to bed. But if you don't look at the spear's integrity at that point, often you can just forget about it. And then the next time you go, oh, I should have dealt with that, but it's too late, I'm heading out again. And it can just go on and on. And what it can lead to is basically landing less fish than you otherwise should get. So what can go wrong with spears? Well, they can become bent, usually to do with big fish, big pelagics or big reef fish smashing into the reef. They can become blunt. That's usually from missing a fish, hitting the reef itself, or from hitting the spine or the actual skull of a large fish. That'll also blunt the spear. You can have problems with the flopper or the barb, as some people call them. If they're dysfunctional, you can lose fish. And then there's problems with the tail end of the spear, the end that goes into the mech. If there's some issues there, sometimes you have trouble loading or it'll fire when it shouldn't fire or won't fire. So we'll look at some of these things and how we can fix them. After you've shot a big fish, you may be concerned that your spear is now bent. The only way to check this is to stand up on something high, so there's nothing underneath the spear, and just holding the very end of it, look right down the whole spear the entire way. You'll see, when you get your eye, you just hold one eye, when you look down it, you'll see whether it's got a bend or not. Well, there might be some waviness where there's a bend one way and a bend back the other way. If it's only slight, it's probably not going to affect the actual accuracy that much, because it will actually bend back into a sort of a straight line when you're firing. But if it's a reasonable bend, it is going to throw your spear off. There's no doubt about that. You can, if you're trying to save money, you don't want to get a new spear, you can have a crack at actually bending it back into shape. That's not it's not without risk, because you can bend it too far and you can make the problem actually worse. But if you're going to throw it out anyway, it's worth a shot just to bend it a little bit, try to get it back into shape. And just remember, if you do that, it may never be the same. But you might get some more uses out of it, so it's worth a shot. Most spears will actually have a tri-point. It's hard to show on video, but most of them have a tri-point. And when we talk about being blunt, now sometimes the tip will just be sort of smashed back down, but sometimes it can actually curl over, or the whole tip can actually be bent one way. So what we need to do is get a file. It's just a normal metal file. You get first cut, second cut, depending on how bad the damage is, and you can file each of the tri-cuts. Now you need to do it one motion, same amount of pressure, same angle, and count the number of times you do each one. The reason for that is you want to get symmetry. So if you can get them all the same, you want the point to be right in the center, you want all of the tri-cuts to be the same length, as in the same gradient going back down the spear, then you'll actually have a perfect point. That is the key. Down at the rear end, the tail of the spear, there may be some problems when you're finding you're loading your gun and the spear's not holding, it's just slipping straight out every time you try to load it, or it's not releasing, it's getting jammed. There are a couple of things you can do. The problem may be in the mech, but let's just say for argument's sake, in this case it's the spear. What you can do is, one option is to file off, if it's not clicking in, you can file off the back end, take a millimetre or so off the back end, or you can actually, in this part of the groove, the one closest to the end, if it looks like it's smoothed off too much, then it's probably not holding in the mech. So you can actually use the file to create a steeper wall there. Then when that's sitting in the mech that way, it will actually be able to hold on to it until you pull the trigger and you release it. So that's something to be aware of. Obviously the other thing is to just make sure there's no fish pieces, the little bits of scale, anything in there, because that gets in there and prevents it from actually holding in the mech and can cause problems. Something else that needs to be looked at is the flopper. Now, this is a new spear, and one thing with new spears, when they're working perfectly, the flopper should hang down about 30 to 50 degrees, like that. Now, when the spear fires, this will, because it's loose, that'll sit straight up, and there's a slight lip at this point. That'll hold the spear up through the motion in the water. Otherwise, just the force of gravity would mean that your spear, throughout the range of the shot, would start to taper. It would taper and start to go down towards the end. This little lip here actually holds it up. It does cost some velocity, but only slightly. It holds it up and gets to the end, hits your target. Now, as you go through the fish, it'll go through like that. Then when you get out the other side, the fish will run and the spear, the flopper, sorry, will actually open out. Now that's what you want, because that means at that point it's engaged, and because it's engaged, this is not going to move too easily back to this status here. So the fish runs, opens that up, and then the fish might slide back up as you're doing your fight, particularly when you're handling the fish, when you're getting it close to you. But this remains engaged, so when it goes back, well, it's not going to come out. If you have a dysfunctional flopper, what can happen is it falls back into this position. So as you go to handle the fish, you're handling it, the fish slides up here particularly, or kicks up here, and then it slides back down and it's gone. A few kicks. Doesn't take much for a fish to get away, and it's gone. So we need to look after this to make sure it's functioning in this manner. We don't want it stuck like that. We don't want it stuck open so that when we fire, if this stayed open when we fired, it would be very inaccurate. These are some of the things we need to consider. There are a few parts to the actual flopper itself that I'm going to show you how to fix. One is where the pin joins. Sometimes this can get damaged, usually when you're hitting a fish into the spine. So we can hit that with a hammer to make sure it's actually binding. Another thing is the actual width of the flopper. This gets, maybe it gets too wide, so it won't hold certain places, or it gets too narrow, so it won't close on the spear. Again, I'll show you a method for fixing that. And if this tip ever gets damaged, you can actually use some tools just to pry that back up if it ever got flattened off. So you just need the right tool, something with a bit of pressure to open that back up. So I'll show you now how to deal with the pin issue and deal with the width of the actual flopper and how it's hugging the spear. So if your pin is faulty or around the pin, you can actually hit it with a hammer on both sides. Just tap it out, get it so it's functioning the way you want it to. Sometimes it gets damaged there. There should be a bit of a pinch up there. And using a tool like this one, you may need to actually squeeze it in so that it actually holds in tight at the right point. If this was too tight or too loose against the spear, we would need to adjust it. Now if it's too tight, what you can do is get a material, a thick material like this is a painter's canvas. You would want something like denim maybe would be another one. Not a thin material, but something that's slightly thicker so that you can wedge it under there. The idea is you wedge it right under as far as you can. So it's wedged, and then what we can do is actually hit the top. So I'm going to fold that over just so I protect it a bit so you can whack that in there. So what it's doing every time I hit that is it's actually forcing that a bit wider, so that if that was too tight it would force it to open up. And then when we actually get that out, take that out, it should be a lot looser. That's for the ones that are too tight. Now if it was too loose, you'd probably just want to use the device to squeeze at the sides. Now if that's not going to create something that's quite even, you can work your way, again to protect you can actually just whack it down like that. But there's some things that you can do to make sure that this is functioning properly. This is a very important part of a spear and the success of that spear, and sometimes overlooked at how important that is. As your spear ages, you're going to get a lot of scratches, particularly in this region here. This is where most of the action happens. Now you should wash your gear, like for all your gear, to get the salt off after every trip, but you'll still get rust. It'll still happen. Now there is a temptation to use a file to scratch all this rust off, particularly right at this point, and you'll think it'll slide through the water better if it's not all roughed up with rust. The problem with that is it will take away a lot of the protection there. A better option is to use an actual metal polish. Now you just need the right type of material to rub it with, but what that'll do is get rid of some of the rust and it won't damage the existing protection still there. If you start using the file to scratch away, you're actually going to shorten the life of your spear because you're going to make the problem worse. You'll fix it that day, and then the next time it'll come back worse, and it'll just get worse and worse and worse. So that's what I recommend. Get a metal polish, just use it there, or anywhere else up the shaft if there's any scratches, and that should extend the life of your spear. You can spray silicone spray at the pointy end of the spear where the spear tip is and the flopper, and it will protect it, prevent a lot of corrosion, a lot of issues there. But just be sure not to spray it at the tail end of the spear, because that will create issues inside the mechanism. Things might slip too much and you'll find the spear just fires when you don't intend it to. So that's spear maintenance. I recommend you follow some of those steps, if not just to land more fish, also just because it will extend the life of your spears and therefore you'll save a bit of money. There will come a point where it's not worth it anymore and you have to buy a new spear. That decision point, that's up to you. But yeah, if you follow some of those maintenance options that I've given you, you'll get a longer life out of your spears, and yeah, you should land more fish.